I have another contestant. Got to move this, sorry. Another contestant for Facebook Idiots on Parade. A guy named Rica Macinnes, I believe is how you pronounce it. If I am pronouncing that incorrectly, I apologize. Rica was whining about Florida because that's all the antique media does as well. See the links underneath the video, by the way, where you can read all this in a little bit more detail. Rica was whining about Florida because they have a lot of electoral votes, and it's a Republican-leaning state. And Florida at the time was having another COVID-19 surge, but apparently Rica doesn't know that the lockdowns, New York, and I informed him of all this. He hasn't responded, and he won't. The lockdowns, I informed him the lockdowns, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., and Rhode Island have average death rates slightly higher than Florida in my final update I posted over on COVID-19 hysteria a week ago. In addition, Florida's population that's 65 and older is a lot higher than those other states, so the gulf is actually a little bit wider. Florida is doing a lot better, actually. And the lockdowns also have death rates much higher, despite the non-lockdowns, which are Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Arkansas. The non-lockdowns have had a much higher percentage of the population be stricken with COVID, yet their death rates are much lower than those lockdown states. His entire argument was, the non-lockdowns have got less people, they don't have many people there, they're not very dense. Just because an area is denser, using his logic, an area that has 0.5 people per square mile should have a higher death rate than one with 0.4 people per square mile. Just because an area is denser or is dense, whatever the yardstick is for dense, doesn't necessarily mean that it should or will have a higher death rate, which adjusts for population. You wouldn't believe all the people who don't understand that. They just say, less population. They don't understand. Well, that's the public school system. East St. Louis has far fewer murders than Chicago, but when one adjusts for population, it is obvious that East St. Louis is far more dangerous than Chicago, unless you're an idiot. I informed Rica that when I was running the numbers for Iowa and its COVID-19 spike, also comparing it to Illinois, California, and New Mexico, did that for several months, the biggest problem counties in Iowa, and I haven't run these numbers for a while, but I ran them several times in 2020. The biggest problem counties in Iowa were rural counties that have a population density much lower than the national average. Iowa is a mostly rural state with lots of guns and cattle. The densest counties in Iowa, which have a density higher than the U.S. average, had death rates lower than the average in Iowa en masse. In addition, I ran the numbers on some of the densest counties in these United States. That was according to the 2010 census. For the longest time, their death rates tracked lower than the national average. It even included Cook County, Illinois, which had a very, very high death rate. Last time I checked, those counties had death rates slightly above the national average, yet much, much lower than the lockdown states, as I identify them, so you know what I'm talking about. So much for his only argument that consists of lower population density, so what? When your only information comes from the media industrial complex, no wonder you're confused. Rica should also take a gander at the trajectories of several states. I linked to this post where I showed cases per week over the last couple months in several states that had high vaccination levels and several evil Republican states that had low vaccination levels. And just as an aside, part of the reason Iowa's vaccination levels are much lower than the national average, one of the groups most skeptical, according to polling data, are white evangelical Christians living in rural areas. Well, guess what? Iowa has a lot of. Just, a little food for thought. That's why. Who is Rica going to blame for the issues plaguing Vermont, New Mexico, Maine, or New York, to name a few? And again, I linked to that post. If you go to the link I provided, you can find all this. Who's he going to blame for those issues plaguing Vermont, New Mexico, Maine, or New York over the past few months? And he likes to pick on Florida and Ron DeSantis because the antique media does, and he just follows their lead and just cuts and pastes and regurgitates crap they excrete. Doesn't have much in his wheelhouse outside of that. Apparently he studied math somewhere, though. I think they owe him a refund. So that was short and sweet, and he hasn't responded to any of my rebuttals, and he won't. Have a nice day, and don't thank me now for the free lesson.